From here. Ta-da. Okay, this way somebody can, I wonder what that other screen is doing. Okay, inversion illusion. I think we did talk about it yesterday, but what the heck. If you're coming up, you're climbing and you level off really hard, really fast, it can make you feel like you're tumbling backwards. And then it makes you want to push the nose forward really abruptly. So what's the best way to counteract this, to not have it occur, is make smooth and slow level offs. Of course, let's put it this way. It's probably better to overshoot by 50 or 100 feet and go smoothly than to go, ah, and go wham. If you're saying wham in your head when you're flying on instruments, then you're going to end up going wham against a rock. And of course, what do you do if you have some weird feelings like this? Fly the instruments. And just to be really clear about flying the instruments, although yes, that's the right answer, and yes, that's what you do, sometimes it's not so easy. Sometimes it's not so easy. What my hope is that you get so used to your instrument scan and you do it over and over and over again that that's just the norm. You do what the instruments tell you, and we practice figuring out if one of the instruments is telling you something wrong so you can stop paying attention to it and just use the other instruments, and you do that over and over and over again. Okay, spatial disorientation. I have done this. I have been in a parking lot and stopped, or maybe it was not a parking lot. I think it was in a multi-lane, and we were all stopped, and the car to the side of me started moving forward, and I felt like my car was in reverse. Has anybody ever had that happen?
I intentionally do that to people.
You intentionally do that to people.
Parked right there, and somebody parks next to me. I wait till right when they stop and start to back up.
It freaks that. It's good to know there are wonderful people like you on the planet, Matt.
I just like to look over and see the reaction.
Because I slam on the brakes, and it's like, oh, my foot's already on the brake, so I like lift it up and slam it again. Oh my God. So the data, so what that is the data straight in front of me where my car is not moving and the objects are not moving, I have a conflict because of my peripheral vision. I'm getting some data that I am moving. Do that. I think you're bad. I think you're bad influence on the rest of the students. Matt. All right. So what can increase the likelihood that you're going to get disoriented? What are the things that are more than that can increase the likelihood that you get disoriented? So being fatigued is going to help with that. Having some kind of anxiety. I don't think people in here tend to be anxious, but you might on your check ride. Anybody ever been anxious on a check ride? Oh, okay, some of us have been anxious on a check ride. When you're doing a heavy pilot workload, if you got behind the power curve, if your task management wasn't as good as it might have been, if you're a little bit behind and you're trying to catch up and do things in a hurry, and you got more things to do than you can actually get done. And of course, the last two hopefully are reasonably preventable, is you're under the influence of alcohol and or prescription drugs. That's one of those reasons. You got to remember. So what happens when you take prescription drugs and then you go up to 5,000 or 8,000 feet? What? Well, generally speaking, the effects of that, the side effects of that drug are compounded, generally speaking. So all the more reason why. There's a great resource. Call the AOPA and say, hey, my doctor prescribed this to me. Is it okay for me to go flying? And they can say no, and you can say okay, and then you can stop taking it. Depending on what place you read, generally you have to have been off of that drug for 6 to 24 hours. It really depends on what it is before you can say, yeah, I'm not being influenced by that anymore, and now it's safe to go flying. Of course, if you have an inner ear, if you have an ear infection of some kind, man, don't go. Holy mackerel. If you're congested, if you can't pop your ears, it's going to apply pressure on your vestibular system. You're gonna be whacked, or you're gonna get whacked. You're gonna be whacked. Is somebody gonna whack you? So does anybody have any questions? These are the things that are going to increase the likelihood that you have some kind of disorientation problem. So just so you know, JFK Jr., guess which one was a factor? What's that? Fatigue. Yeah, he was flying at night. He'd already had a full day. And he went flying VFR when it was IMC. All right, I got to find somebody else to talk about. So some other symptoms besides the one we've talked about are you might be a little bit lightheaded, you might be dizzy, you might be nauseous. That's not on the list. Why is that not on the list? You might feel like you can't sit up straight, the sensation of spinning, and you're just flat out confused. It's like you're looking at the gauges and you cannot tell what you need to be doing. If it gets to that point, it's like, of course, the problem is then, what do you got to do then? Fly the instruments. So in general, if you want to prevent disorientation or get rid of any kind of disorientation, is move your head less. So that's one thing about cockpit organization. Get everything you're going to need for the flight on your lap and strap it down. So the first 4 airplane rides when I was in navigator school were in a little a 2-seat trainer, and the 4th ride was an aerobatic ride. It was a T-37, and not on the first 3 rides, but on the last ride, we went upside down and yanked and cranked. They were trying to see if I would puke. They don't tell you that they're trying to see if you'd puke, but they call it a contact ride. I never did find out why they call it a contact ride, but it's an aerobatic ride. But you got to make sure that everything you've got is in a pocket and zipped or tied down. Literally, they told us to tie our pen or our pencil on a string. So if we were holding onto it and trying to write down and we let go, the pencil or string wouldn't fall down and get into the ejection seat mechanism. Think about that for a second. You have a metal cross pen. Back then I had a chrome one. And if you dropped it and it fell down in there somewhere and now it gets stuck in your ejection seat, you're generally not very happy. So what would you have to do in flight? Well, you're either going to look around, but there's not really any room in that thing to crawl around. You in your airplane, you don't really want things rolling down and getting in the rudder pedals, do you? But in this case, we're talking about things falling down and now you have to go retrieve them. Think about trying to retrieve a pencil or a pen underneath your knees, between your in front, closer to you than your toes. How far are you having to lean forward? How far is your head changing its normal plane? So cockpit organization is much more important in IFR flying than it is in VFR flying. And not that you aren't going to be looking for traffic. Does anybody remember? ATC is required to separate what 2 kinds of traffic? IFR from IFR. IFR to IFR. Time permitting, they will tell you via traffic advisories, but even when you're an IFR flight plan, they are not responsible for keeping you out of the way of VFR traffic. So if you're on an IFR flight plan and the weather out there is good enough for people to be flying VFR, you're still having to look out the window technically just as much as you were before. Now, is it likely, especially around the central San Joaquin Valley, the air traffic controllers aren't so busy and they're probably going to be able to give you traffic advisories without you even asking? Yeah. But let's think about going to Los Angeles. The air traffic controllers down there are way busier. So we already covered this earlier this morning. Don't over-control the aircraft. We're never going to go past 5 degrees unless we're practicing on purpose unusual attitude recovery and practice like let's do a stall under the hood. Woo-hoo-hoo. Unless we're trying to do that on purpose under 99.9% of the time, we're never going to intentionally in a Warrior go more than 5 degrees pitch up, 5 degrees pitch down, or 18 degrees roll left or 18 degrees roll right. So compared to what you're used to, it's really easy to over-control. So right now is the good time in the simulator to get into that habit pattern. And of course, we all know this one. All right. Motion sickness. Commonly caused by vestibular disorientation. Like I mentioned yesterday, I think it is pretty much people driving cars. They never get car sick because what the car is doing to their body is close to what they're seeing when they look out the window. It's when you're not looking out the window at the road that your likelihood of getting car sick goes up. The problem is with IFR, you don't get to look out there and see what the road is doing. The typical symptoms are nausea, sweating, dizziness, and if it's really bad, vomiting. You know what they say about pilots? There's 3 kinds of pilots. Have I told you this story? There's those of us that have puked, those of us that will puke, and those of us that have puked and will puke again. That's the kind of pilots there are. There's only 3 kinds. Ask me to tell you a story after I turn the microphone off. All right, if you're in VMC, you need to be looking outside for traffic anyway. That's going to dramatically reduce the likelihood that you're having some type of motion sickness. If you're in IMC, what do you got? All you got is the instruments. But don't be looking around, turning your head, gabbing to your passengers. Maybe it's like you need to say, I need to focus on flying the airplane. We need to stop talking for about 10 minutes and fly the airplane. And that way you're not accidentally turning your head sideways. There's 5 IFR optical illusions I think you need to pay attention to. That these are review, but you're a lot more likely to hit these when you're flying IFR. If you fly in haze, your brain is used to seeing things out of focus as meaning that they're farther away. Which we think about it and you go, yeah, so what's the big deal? Well, we're going to be breaking out of the clouds and there may be rotten visibility, but legal visibility after we break out of the clouds and the runway's a little fuzzy. Guess what? We're going to think it's farther away than it really is. Refraction of water, we're a lot more likely to be flying through the rain if we're IFR. And it makes you think you're at a higher altitude than you are. You look down at the ground and it seems farther away because it's not as clear. And of course, we're going to be flying into and out of fog. And flying into fog tends to make you think that your nose is pitching up. I remember the very first time I flew IMC ever. I was on a cross country with my very first instrument flight instructor. Yeah, we were coming back from Bakersfield or Monterey to Fresno, and we had filed IFR. My instructor was current, so we flew IFR, and it wasn't thunderstorms or anything, but there was this big fat cloud, and it was like 5,000 or 10,000 feet tall and miles wide, and the side of the cloud was pretty much vertical. It wasn't just kind of thin and they got thicker and thicker and thicker. It was just like VMC and then right in the cloud. We were flying straight towards it, and I felt like I was flying into a wall of cement that was like 10,000 feet tall and 5 miles wide, and we're just going for it. After we entered it, then I was okay. I personally have never flown in fog. Ground lighting. Straight ground lights, like, coming into Fresno Airport, Clovis Avenue, Shaw Avenue, stuff like that. Things can look like runways. The good news about the Fresno Airport, it's at a, close to a 45-degree angle to most of the main streets. So that makes it easier to pick out the difference between it and the city streets. There's also nothing around it, so my short story is I had a private pilot certificate. I might have had close to 100 hours. I flew a 1969 Cessna 172. It's the one my wife ended up buying, from Reedley to Fullerton Airport in Los Angeles. And at Fullerton Airport, let's see if I can do this. At Fullerton Airport, so here was the runway. And here was the taxiway, and here was the parking ramp, and here was, well, it was a lot longer than that, right? So it's like that. Here's the taxiways, here's the parking ramp, here's the cars, and then the city street was right here, and there was a city street right here, and there was a city street right here, and there was a city street right there, and it was at night, and everything was lit up. So literally, I sort of made my own instrument approach. I flew to Seal Beach Airport, and then I was supposed to turn off of Seal Beach on fly outbound on a certain radio for like 8 minutes or whatever. So I hit the VOR, and I turn, and I call up Fullerton Tower. I think they were with the equivalent of what's now Class Delta airspace. And I'm starting my descent from my cruise altitude, and they say, you know, report downwind. I was going to enter a straight into the downwind. And I'm just looking, and my 8 minutes comes up, and I'm looking, and I'm leveling. I've leveled off at traffic pattern altitude, and I can't find it. All of a sudden, it's like 9 minutes, and I realize, okay, I went past it. So it turns out I was the only one on frequency. Fullerton Tower, 79122. I think I overflew the airport. I could tell when he replied he was trying not to chuckle. He was being trying to be really nice about it. That's affirmative, 79122. You flew right past the airport, and he gave me a heading to turn to. He was very nice about it. Of course, in later years, I go, you just sat there and watched me fly by. I'm sure if there was other airplanes and it was going to be a problem, he just said 79122. What the hell do you think? You know, what are you doing? Blah blah blah. But I flew right past it, and the only reason I could find it is because he turned me around and gave me a heading straight towards it. And for some reason, I couldn't find the rotating beacon flying into it. That first time when I turned around and came back, it was easier to see it.
I had trouble seeing sometimes when I first started flying at night.
Yeah?
Yeah, my first cross-country night. Fuel, it was hard. I couldn't see Majesco. I couldn't see the
Who was it?
Yeah.
I think it was Matt or Craig flying.
So anyways, yeah, I couldn't see nothing all the way up to like Castle.
So it won't be, I don't know if, let's go to featureless terrain. What we're going to be doing now is, the terrain might not be featureless, but there might be a cloud layer below you with no features. So if you're descending down and there's a cloud layer down there, it may feel like you're higher than you really are. So, of course, the good news is I don't think we as humans flying small airplanes, I think we have a good idea about trusting our altimeter to decide how high we are. We're not like looking out the window during cruise and going, oh yeah, I got plenty of altitude. I think we're looking at our altimeter a lot, so maybe that one's not too bad. But the problem is, if it's featureless terrain, has anybody ever I'm trying to think, have you ever tried to land on an airport where the runway was about 100 feet from the ocean or from a lake that was 10 miles in diameter? New Orleans, not New Orleans International, the Class Bravo Airspace Airport, but north of that, on the other side of downtown New Orleans, which is a little south of that, it's right on Lake Pontchartrain, I think, which is about at sea level. The airport elevation is like 7 feet or something crazy like that. But the entire VFR, the entire approach to the main runway is over the water. There's absolutely no features. So it makes that approach a lot more interesting. Of course, if it's a really good airport, they probably have some way to assist you on figuring out how much to descend. It's probably called a what? A PAPI or a VASI. Do you think they put PAPIs and VASIs at instrument airports? Maybe. I don't know how they did it, but the airport commission at Reedley Airport must harass the city a lot, because that's one of the nicest podunk little airports I've ever seen. They got taxiway signs and PAPI and runway lights. And I've flown, when I learned to fly out of that airport, it was about 1,500 feet long, it was 35 feet wide, and it was not perfectly smooth asphalt with weeds on either side. There was one taxiway that led out to one end of the runway and one taxiway that led out to the other. There were no signs, there were no lights, there was no markings, there was no paint, and the width of the runway was about the same width as the wingspan. So think about learning to take off and land, especially land in crosswind conditions. That was a good old, you had to get good. All right. Any questions about that? Okay. Part 2. Before I get started on that, I'm going to pass out. I didn't pass out 4? Okay. Well, so here it is. Should have gave that to you yesterday, huh? Some people. You mean like this right there? You keep me straight, okay? Yeah, have a good time. I hope everything comes out all right. You never heard that one before? Okay, you don't have to laugh at that. So the downside, I just barely got to FAA questions this morning. FAA questions, woohoo! I love FAA. Oh. Everybody likes FAA questions, right? So here's your first set. Question? I got this. I've got an instructor logged in to the ASA online prepware practice test site, and they've chopped up all the instrument questions into 5 or 6 or 7 sections, and this is the one that the FAA lists as flight instruments. So I didn't count all the other questions. I don't know how many there are. There's 129 on this right here. So what I want to do is, I want to tell you, there it is, the questions that you ought to look at this weekend, because there's no ground school tomorrow, right? Tomorrow's Friday? Sweet. Although, what does happen at 10 o'clock tomorrow on Fridays? Anybody remember? How about you, Jonathan? Yeah, it's our first and only meeting for our flying lab. So at 10 o'clock tomorrow, we're still going to be in here. It's just that there's no lecture. We're going to review Flight 115. In the meantime, let's mark this up so you know which instrument questions that you need to, we're going to start catching up here. So you can just put a tick mark by it. So these are the ones you ought to look up the answers for. So number 2, and this is, what I did, I put a 4 next to it because that's section 4. So maybe you want to put a 4 next to it. So if I had been on my toes, I would have given you this yesterday and told you this yesterday. So obviously I'm flat-footed. So number 2 is for section 4. Number 8 is for section 4. Number 11 is for section 4. Number 12 is for section 4. I only looked for section 4 stuff today. Number 18 is section 4. Number 19 is section 4. Number 22 is section 4. I guess I did number 5 too. So 23 is number 5. Number 27 is number 4. Number 29 is number 4. Number 30 is number 4. 34 is number 4. 35 is number 4. 38 is number 4. 39 is number 4. 40 is number 4. 43 is number 4. 44 is number 4. Man, there's like 500 compass questions in here. Number 45 is 4. Number 48 is number 4. Number 50 is number 4. 52 is 4. 53 is section number 4. 59 is section number 4. So let's see, that was 52, 53, 59. Then number 60 is number 4. So what I'm going to try to remember right after class is to send out an email and tell you where the FAA's test supplement for the instrument written is. It's on the FAA website. And then I'll also post it and turn on flight 115 or flight 111, and I'll stuff it up in there. So if you're cruising around on Canvas anyway, you can click it and you can download it so you can see the color version. So when you're looking at these questions, you can look at the same figure that you would have on the FAA written test. So number 60 is number 4. Number 67 is number 4. 68 is number 4. 71 is section 4. 72 is section 4. 73 is section 4. 74 is section 4. 76 is section 4. 81 is section 4. 85 is section 4. 86 is section 4. 88 is section 4. 93 and 94 are both section 4. 93 is section 4. 94 is section 4. 96 is section 4. 113 is section 4. 116 is section 4. 118 is section 4. 121 is section 4. 123 is section 4. 125 is section 4. And then 129 is section 4. So my estimate is, so what you ought to do on the section, okay. So on if you pull out this piece of paper that says 05 flight instruments number 2, so you ought to write in there where it says FA question, it says blank. Just write in section 4 so that you know what you need to do this weekend is look up the answers to all those questions. And, oh wait, there was one from section 5, right? Okay, so you can write and section 5. So if I can continue to come in every day, so my luck, if I'm doing a good job on Monday, I'll come in and before you leave, I'll give you the one that says 06, and if they're out of this document here, and if they're out of a different document, I'll hand you a new one. It'll be like engine gauges, and then I'll have the list of questions on here, and we won't have to spend time in class telling you which ones they are. Let's see. Okay. So, gyros. Whoops. Still going. Okay, great. So I recommend you take good notes. There's going to be a quiz on Monday, the 19th. And it's all right. There's going to be a quiz on Monday the 19th. And it's going to be that last little bit of human factors, all that, the rest of that disorientation and motion sickness stuff. What we covered today. Plus all of the flight instruments that we covered today. We're going to probably still be a little bit behind, but I think we'll be able to catch up here in the next couple of days because the majority of the flight instrument stuff is a little redundant from private pilot, but I can tell you that on the oral exam, your examiner is going to spend more time on your flight instruments, gyro, compass, and pedostatic system. They're going to spend more time asking you questions about that than they did on your private. Because when you're flying around in VMC, if all your gauges go bad, it's not that big of a deal. If your IMC and all the gauges go bad, then you're far, far, far unhappier. So section 4, if you looked at the reading assignment, is generally gyros and the compass. So that's what we're going to dive into today. First of all, a vacuum system is what you find on light airplanes. When you get into bigger and bigger airplanes, you don't have to write that down, but they tend to go to 100% electric gyros. They don't have a vacuum system. Because let's face it, where's the vacuum pump on a little tiny airplane? Where is it physically in the airplane? Is it behind the ELT, behind the aft bulkhead? Yeah, it's bolted onto the engine. It's bolted onto the engine. And we have to run a vacuum line from that vacuum pump through the firewall into the back of the instruments. In a big multi-engine jet, that's a long way. It's a lot easier to just have multiple backup electrical power sources and have maybe 2 electric-driven attitude indicators and 2 electric-driven directional gyros and 2 electric-driven turn coordinators. But in light airplanes, I'd say if you went out to the Fresno Yosemite Airport and it has a piston engine in it, even if it's a piston engine twin, that 99 out of 100 of them, the attitude indicator and the directional gyro are powered by vacuum pumps. I used to teach a ground school on PA-44 Piper Seminoles. Has anybody ever seen one of those airplanes? Is there one at JB Aeronautics? Do they have a Duchess? The Seneca. They got a Seneca. Okay. And that Seneca, I taught ground school on PA-44 Seminoles. They got 2 vacuum pumps. If one dies, there's a valve. So if one sucks harder than the other one, the vacuum pump that has the higher suction, it'll power all your instruments. So it's really nice. If one engine quits, you still have a vacuum pump to run those 2 gyros. If one of the vacuum pumps quit, instead of an engine, you still have vacuum to run those gyros. You don't have that luxury on an airplane, on a single engine airplane. Don't write this down. But there are some times when you use a single engine airplane for unscheduled airline work, also known as charter or air taxi, where if you want to fly at night or IFR, you have to have a second vacuum source. So they put a second vacuum pump on the engine, or they switch over and turn those into electric gyros, and then they have to have a second alternator, which is very unusual on piston-powered airplanes, to have 2 vacuum pumps on the same engine or to have 2 alternators on the same, because you hardly ever need it. Usually by the time they do that, all right, I want to draw a picture that I'm going to make you draw on the test. Interesting, I looked at the PA-28 Warrior 2 Pilot Operating Handbook, and it doesn't have a diagram of the vacuum system. And that's not the picture of it either. Oh, there it is. Huh? You will. Thou shalt. So let's see how well I can do here. Attitude indicator, directional gyro, suction. Yes, vacuum has 2 U's in it. You may recall from almost a year ago that I didn't make you have to draw, but I told you I'm going to give you a diagram. You know what? I'll do the same. I'm going to give you a diagram. I made you learn to be able to label 2 diagrams in Private Pilot Ground School 1. A basic electrical system, effectively, mostly, it was very accurate for small pipers, both a Tomahawk and a Warrior. And a fuel system that was very accurate for low-wing airplanes. If I'm going to give you a Cessna, there's a couple of very slight differences on the electrical, and there's a couple of slight differences on the fuel system. But you're going to be taking your check ride in a Warrior, or for your private or commercial, you're going to do it in a low-wing Piper, so it worked out great. But this is really a diagram that works for all small airplanes that only have one vacuum pump. That 99% of the reciprocating airplanes out there, if you take out the multi-engine airplanes, obviously, if it's a twin, there's going to be another pump in there somewhere. But this is the way the system works. So there's the 2 gauges that run off of the vacuum system, the attitude indicator and the directional gyro. The suction is just telling you the difference between outside air pressure and the pressure on the vacuum side of the system. You'll notice that at the air intake, there's an air filter. You really need that air coming into the gyros to not have dirt and dust, because that would go into the gyros. So you really need to have an air filter out there. You don't have to write this down, but the most common cause, there's 2 common causes for the pressure, the suction pressure to be too low, and one is the air filter is getting clogged, and the other is you need to adjust the pressure regulator, but you don't have to write that down. So air, we could look at it backwards, try it the other way, and say, you know what, the vacuum pump is bolted to the engine. In fact, maybe we ought to make a reference to that. I'm going to write engine driven next to it. So I'm going to put an arrow right there. So it's driven off of the engine. So let's talk about driven off of the engine. So if you're doing an engine run-up at, what do you do engine run-ups at in the Warrior? When you do a magneto check, what? 2,000? Okay. What does the suction gauge read? Yeah, it reads right up there between 4.9 and 5.1. You probably haven't noticed, so don't feel bad if you don't know the answer. How far do you have to pull the RPMs back before the suction goes below 4.9? You probably never tried it. Did anybody try that in a Tomahawk either?
In the Tomahawk, I went out, but unless you're over like 1,500, it doesn't.
Okay. Well, there's no specification that the FAA publishes on how low the RPM has to be able to go and still get full vacuum. But if you pull it back, now here's an interesting thought. You're in a Tomahawk or a Warrior. If you pull the throttle all the way back and you're trimmed up on approach at 70 knots or whatever it is, how low does the engine RPM? Does it get much below 1,500? Does it get below 1,200? It doesn't get much below 12, does it? I've never flown a Tomahawk, so I don't know what it is, and it's been so long since I've flown a Warrior. In my airplane, that thing, the approach is at 70 miles an hour, which is at 60 knots. You do an approach at 60 knots. It doesn't get to 1,000. I don't think it goes below 1,200, just because I'm flying. I've got 60 knots of wind blowing the propeller around, plus the idle gasoline. But at that moment, it's okay if the suction is less than normal, less than the green arc. Here's the interesting thing, though. You're coming into land on an instrument approach. What's going to happen to your suction, generally speaking, if you reduce engine RPM, say below 1,500, what might happen? Suction might get less. So what's going to start happening to the RPM of your attitude indicator gyro and your directional gyro? It's crease in a negative way. Yeah, it decreases down. Is that different than decreasing up?
No, it's just that it creases.
It creases, yeah, okay. Yeah, it creases in a downward direction. Okay, now one good news about that is you're not turning very much and you're not in that situation for very long. The other good news is that generally you're not down at 1500. You don't know this yet, but you're going to fly your instrument approaches at 100 knots because there's jets behind you at Fresno. And if you don't fly at 100 knots, air traffic control is going to say, would you please fly faster? Well, I don't know if they'll say best speed, but they'll say, can you push it up 20 knots or something like that? That probably won't happen because your instructor is going to say, we're going to fly our instrument approaches at 100 knots, period. Regardless of whether you're at Fresno or Chandler or Madera. I think they turned on some GPS approaches at Reedley International now. So you can fly an instrument approach at Reedley, I think. I don't have an IFR certified GPS, so I don't know. But if you are level and to go 100 knots, are you going to be down there around 1500? You're probably not even going to be, you're going to be at 2300 or maybe 21 or 2200. And if you're descending at 500 feet per minute, how low are we going in the simulator? 2100. And that's to get a 500 or 700 foot a minute descent. So the good news is that it's going to be very uncommon for us to have an RPM so low under instrument flying conditions that we have to start thinking about it. The great news is, what is Mr. Johnson trying to get you to do on a regular basis in the simulator? Is do a scan, which every now and then includes the suction. So if you see something a little below 4.9, you're going to start thinking about it. Now here's the great news is it's not like it goes down to 4.9 and at 4.8 everything dies. It's not like that. It's very, very gradual. So you probably wouldn't even notice anything at 4.8 or 4.7 or 4.6 or 4.5, especially if you only did it that way for a minute or two. Okay, what's the likely failures in flight are the shaft going to the engine breaks. Do you really, they actually make a place in that shaft that the metal gets skinny, it gets smaller. So if something happens to the vacuum and it gets really hard to turn, that shaft will break and nothing will damage the inside of the engine. It's bolted on the back of the engine where the magnetos are. And the camshaft is geared into the engine. Do you really want pieces of metal flying around in there with the gears that run the magneto or run the camshaft? No. So so if the vacuum pump starts having way too much friction, something's wrong with it, it's called a shear shaft. That shaft will break. It'll shear, but metal won't fall into the engine. So that's one failure. And that, if you're looking at your suction gauge, it'll be sitting there, it might go down a little, and then it's going to go down to zero. But that's the least common failure mode for the vacuum pump. The most common failure mode for the vacuum pump is internally it wears out and it won't suck hard enough. And it's possible that it could wear really fast. One little thing inside breaks, it's got carbon veins in there, you know, like pencil lead, but really thick. But if a little bit of it breaks off in there, it could start wearing it out really fast. So across one flight, it could be working, and across an hour, it could go down below 4 or 3 or 2. So that's the most common failure mode of a vacuum pump, is to not have it die immediately, but for it to go slow. Which means if you're not checking your suction gauge, it's going to be insidious. You're not going to know it's coming. But hey, you're generating a very nice scan that includes that. So the regulator, you don't have to write this down, but aircraft mechanics change air filters, and aircraft mechanics adjust the regulator. That vacuum pump probably will put out 6 or 7 or 8 inches of mercury suction at sea level, but the regulator is set, hopefully, to really close to 5.0, so that let's just say you push the power up and at 1800 RPMs it's at 5.0, you're at 1800, you go all the way to 20. The pump is sucking more, but the regulator is saying, you know, the The gyros only need 5 inches. Does anybody have any questions about this? Okay. So I'll tell you here. So for the test, I'm going to give you a blank one of these, and you're going to tell me where the air intake is, the air filter, and I don't care if you have the attitude indicator versus the directional gyro versus the suction, although I'll probably draw the suction gauge smaller. You got to understand that there's a regulator, a vacuum pump. The vacuum pump is driven by the engine, and the air actually blows overboard into the engine compartment, but we don't really care about it by then. So Mr. Asman had a good point the other day. I heard him talking about if you can, and you're doing a pre-flight, you could reach in and try to rotate the magnetos, and if you could, you would be really unhappy. Well, you wouldn't be that unhappy. You'd be happy. You go, yeah, I figured it out before takeoff. Oh. So this is what a vacuum. This is what a vacuum pump looks like. Here's one right here. Let's see if we can find one on the back of this airplane engine. So this looks like an air conditioning compressor, and I can't see a vacuum pump on that one. All right, fine. Here's a vacuum pump. You can see these vanes right there. They're made out of carbon. If it breaks and starts wearing that out really fast, it could go bad. Yeah, you look at this. It broke. Yeah. Oh, sorry. Here you go. So here's one. Here's a better picture. They don't all have cooling fins on them, although a lot of them have cooling fins. So here's this vacuum pump, and it's bolted into the back of the engine. Look at this is very common, some kind of a metal tube that turns, and then there's a rubber hose that goes back towards the firewall, goes back towards the back of the instrument panel. And then somewhere on this thing is going to be a metal tube that comes out. It's usually an inch or two long, and air comes out. So the likelihood, this one, it can't rotate because it doesn't adjust like a magneto. So there's really not a lot to look at it and say, oh, is it going to fail or is it about to fail? But the next time you're doing a pre-flight, you could ask your instructor, which one of those things is the vacuum pump? Like, here's one. Oh, okay, good. Here's a vacuum pump. Where'd that thing go? There's an alternator, another alternator. Where'd that vacuum pump go? So here's a vacuum pump. And this hose, remember, it's sucking air to the engine, so this is probably the regulator. All right, that's enough pictures. Why is that? Let's look at the construction of a gyro first. So a gyro has a rotating wheel in it, and the wheel is made out of metal, so it has some significant weight. So when we spin this up to speed and it's spinning fast, it has a lot of inertia, a lot of momentum. That's part of what you need to have a gyro, is momentum or inertia. And it's got 2 gimbals on it, so this thing can measure 2 dimensions. It can measure pitch of the airplane, and it can measure bank of the airplane. It can't tell you whether the airplane is going straight up or straight down. It doesn't tell you that. It only tells you if the aircraft is banking, and it doesn't. Well, let's put it doesn't tell you if you're yawing. Maybe that's a better way to describe it. So inside that gyro stays stationary. And now the case around it, which is bolted to the airplane, it's the part that tilts. So you're just looking at a different piece. When you fly that airplane, you push the nose down, it makes it look like what's inside the attitude indicator is going up. You're just looking at it from a different angle. That part you're looking at is actually hooked up to the gyro. It's not moving because it has rigidity in space. Speaking of rigidity in space, if you've got a wheel and it's heavy and you spin it rapidly enough, then it will try to stay fixed in the plane that it's rotating in the plane that it's spinning. I think that's really close to verbatim out of the Jeppesen right there. I found an old slide I had made up. It's like, yeah, okay. So this rigidity in space, now this applies to all gyro instruments. But you'll notice it says it's got to be spun up and spin rapidly, so that's why we need the vacuum system, is to suck air across the vanes on that gyro so it stays spinning. And if you mount it on gimbals, gimbals is just what it's bolted to. If it's mounted on gimbals and it can rotate in relation to the case, the box it's installed in, then whenever the airplane pitches or whenever the airplane rolls, the gyro can stay rigid in space while the airplane moves, and now you're looking at the gyro indication from a different angle. You're looking at it looking down or looking up or looking tilted to the left or tilted to the right. So in airplane gyros, we're always going to have at least one gimbal so that the gyro can stay rigid in space and we can just look at it from a different angle. So we're always going to have a heavy piece of metal. We're going to always need to spin it around. It'll remain fixed in the plane. That is, it'll try not to move if it's still spinning. And if we put it on gimbals, it'll rotate. It'll be able to stay in its own plane while we move. Fortunately, this is a review from 11 months ago. So now we're going to talk about precession. And we're not talking about a ceremony where we all get in uniform and march. Okay, fine. If you have a gyro and you try to push it, the effective force occurs 90 degrees later towards the direction it's rotating. So that's one of those weird things about gyros. That's actually one reason why it's easier to ride, or actually rigidity in space. That's why it's easier to ride bicycles and motorcycles when you're moving, because the wheels act as gyros. You ever notice on a bicycle it's harder to stay balanced the slower you go? In fact, when you get to zero, it makes it really hard to balance. Not that you can't, but it's hard. The faster you go, the more they act as gyros, and the wheel wants to stay rigid in its plane of rotation. If you act on a gyro, if you push on a gyro, it's going to act like you actually pushed it 90 degrees later in the plane, along the plane of rotation. So if we push on a gyro because we do something to it, it's going to impact it, and we're going to get to that. The other thing is that the bearing that it spins on, and if the gimbals have a little friction and the bearing has a little friction, then it won't spin as fast as it's supposed to, so it won't be as rigid in space as we'd like it to. So for instance, go ahead, question? So for instance, if we have to go up and reset that directional gyro every 3 or 4 minutes, that's telling me that either the bearing or the gimbals in that thing have so much friction that there's something wrong with it. If you read documents about, well, how often should I be checking it? For directional gyro, the stuff I read is every 10 or 15 minutes. So if I only need to check it every 10 or 15 minutes, but I notice that I keep resetting it, so I reduce how long I wait, and I find that every 3 to 4 minutes I have to set it, it's off by 5 degrees, that tells me something's wrong inside that gyro. Now, here's the question of the day, pilots. Is that gyro likely to get better or worse or stay the same? Everything gets better. Yeah. It's probably not going to stay the same. It might. It would be really hard for me to think it's going to get better, especially if it's doing it across a whole flight. Does the possibility exist that it's going to get worse? Could it get so worse that now I can't even use it? Okay. Now here's one of those terrible gray areas. You are not going to be able to find an FAR that says if you have to set a gyro more often than every 8.7 minutes per 5 degrees, then it's unairworthy. You're not going to find that written down. In this case, you have to use some judgment and say, if I'm an instrument pilot, how negatively is that going to impact me if I have to reset it every 5 minutes? At some point, you're going to say, that's going to impact me so much, I can't fly that airplane. So I wish I had this magic set of books and said, if it looks like this, it's airworthy, and if it looks like that, it's not. I'm telling you, there's a third piece of paper in the middle that's printed in gray. Of course, we already know that there's 3 gyroscopic flight instruments in small aircraft. The attitude indicator. On a test, if I ask you what are the 3 and you put capital A, capital I will accept that answer. If you put directional gyro or heading indicator, HI, I would accept DG or HI as a complete answer. And if you put turn coordinator or you wrote the letter capital T, capital C, I would accept that as a complete answer. I might also ask you, what are the, I can almost guarantee you this is the way I would write the test question. What are the 3 gyros in small airplanes flying IFR, and what powers them? What powers each of them? But hey, this is just a review from last semester, maybe even from some place earlier this week. Which brings up a really good point, that I just thought of. I'm just going to leave it at that. I'll tell you what, I'm not going to ask about this switch. Does anybody think they have any problem telling their designated pilot examiner, how do you get power to the 14-volt DC bus? So I want to talk about this turn coordinator circuit. We know how power gets to vacuum gauges. Now we know how power gets to turn coordinators. Show me the switch in there where you can turn off the turn coordinator. Doesn't exist. You ever notice when you turn on the electrical master during a pre-flight, it sounds like something starts making noise behind the instrument panel? Here's an interesting thought, especially if you're flying in a fleet. You start getting used to how much noise it makes. What if it makes 3 or 4 times louder noise than you're used to? What does that tell you, Alejandro? The turn coordinator is making 3 or 4 times more noise than you're used to. What do you think's going on? Is it just happy and it's singing? Oh, yeah. It's getting worn out. Something's going on. I'm telling you, I think there's friction going on in there that hasn't been there before. So how do we like friction inside of our gyro instruments? How much do we like that kind of friction? We like friction in ultimate fighting championship fights, right? Okay, if you're not into that kind of human violence, that's okay. So there's a fun decision now you're going to get to make. So here's a fun thought. At that moment, has it gone bad to your knowledge? It's making a lot of noise, but to your knowledge, is it an unairworthy instrument at that moment? No. How are you going to decide? Now it's a human factor. I'm going to put on my headphones so I can't hear it. Anybody got an idea? How are you going to decide it? I'm not saying you need to, let's say you decide I'm not going to cancel the flight yet. It still may be working. Yeah, well, what can you do before takeoff? It's hard to do standard rate turns on the ground. Well, you're gonna get that engine up to at least 1,000 or 1,200 on just to get out of the parking ramp, right? You're going to be making a couple of turns. Now, granted, if you haven't got it up past 1,500 or 1,800 RPM, it won't be completely up to speed. But can you look at the little wings and see if they turn? We don't pay that much attention to it as a VFR pilot because we don't, quite frankly, we don't really care that much about it. Now we're going to care about it a lot. So we haven't got to that part yet, but we're going to go over how do I look at my instruments after I started the engine, while I'm taxiing, and during engine run-up to confirm as much as I can that they're working. Are we going to be able to tell if the airspeed indicator works? No. But are we going to be able to tell if our turn coordinator is doing something? Are we going to be able to tell if our attitude indicator? Yeah, attitude indicator, or we're going to really close. Yeah, it's pretty even. It doesn't show a pitch change or a bank when I turn the airplane. But how about the directional gyro? Okay, so I submit that what you could do is, okay, I'm going to pay special attention to the turn coordinator while I'm taxiing. And maybe after I do my engine run-up, maybe I do a little circle in the engine run-up area after it's been at, 2,000 RPMs for a minute. Because now that's really where the rubber hits the road. Is it going to work at 2,000 RPM? Does anybody have any questions? So if I wrote the blank here and I didn't have TC here and I didn't have CB stands for circuit breaker and, of course, 14-volt bus. So you would need to be able to label the bus bar and the circuit breaker, the turn coordinator. Oh, wait. And the ground. So effectively, if you turn on the electrical master switch and there's battery power or alternator power, is the turn coordinator going to be supplied with electrical power? Yes, okay. So it's 20 after. So to remind you, what you need to do is look up a bunch of FAA questions to get ready for the quiz. So on the quiz, there's going to be 1 or 2 FAA questions, and it'll say flight instruments number 27, and I'll have the question, and you'll need to tell me the answer, and 80, 89, or whatever it is. So you'll be able to flip right through it, but only if you answered the FAA questions and you bring that piece of paper in, that stapled document, you get to bring that as open note during the quiz. Does anybody have any questions on what you need to do with those FAA questions between now and then?
The answers are going to be, you're going to put the silver stick or on canvas, right?
I'm going to start sticking the electronic versions on canvas. But for today, you have a hard copy you can work off of. And, of course, you need to read ahead and be ready for a lecture on number 5. We'll have a quiz on everything we covered today plus FAA questions. Thank you very much. Goodbye. See you later, alligator.